live.
Get my in-program Dr. Pepper out.
Uh-oh, there it is. Jesse, it's time for us to settle in and have a good Bible discussion. It's good to be back home again. I was on a little bit of a journey this past weekend. It's good to see Terry across the digital wires, and hopefully as you jump in with us today, you're going to be enriched by our spiritual discussions. We've got a challenging topic that we've picked out for ourselves to discuss today, and we're going to try to do it in 30 minutes or less. Good luck with that, but we'll do our very best with that too. Terry, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. It just hit me. I should get like a product placement payment from Dr. Pepper for these videos. I don't know if we can make that happen or not.
Or Wheaties. I think the over-the-shoulder Wheaties shot that we're getting here is pretty strong. I'm going to see if I can get some canoe branding, some taco branding in. We can probably underwrite the times we talk together a little bit better. Let's get to the heart of the matter, because we've got a lot of things to unbox today.
Absolutely.
So we're going to talk a little bit about admonishing the unruly. And what we kind of mean by that is the big basket of struggle, spiritually speaking, that comes into play when we're talking about withdrawal from the biblical terminology. We're talking about scopio, or marking or noting someone, talking about the factors involved in that. We're talking about the tendrils that interact in the relationships that are existing in those conditions, whether they are congregational in nature, maybe workplace in nature, maybe family in nature. And how do we look at the Bible, look at the scriptures, from the standpoint of those who preach, but also those who serve in congregations, and how can we do this to God's standard in an effective way that meets God's goals? And Terry and I have interacted with these things both personally as individuals, but also as preachers and in other congregational ways, with a design to say, this is what God wants us to do. By intent, we've started at, I think, for me at least, the most important starting point, and that's being loving in a biblical way. And I'll talk about it from my perspective first, looking at some of the Bible passages involved. And Terry, you jump in obviously as normal, and let's get to work. When I talk about being loving, it's not just about your attitude. I think that's where it starts. That's where your mindset is. As disciples of the Son of God, we generate love in the same way that God's love is manifested for us. But I'm meaning specifically this area. And I'll use this analogy. If you're at work one day, luckily going about your job, and the boss randomly comes to you and says, you're fired, and you have no forewarning of a breach in relationship, no forewarning that you were not working together well, and your stuff is boxed up and you are set to the curb, you would most reasonably freak out. I think sometimes in the edges of relationships of Christians, we kind of do the same thing. And this is what I mean by it. We might preach on biblical discipline on an annual basis. Yeah, it's part of our sermon package. Once a year we talk about, we got to withdraw from the ungodly sinners. And we say, okay, I've done my duty. I've preached that sermon and I'm good now. But we don't build a relationship with our brethren so that we know how they're doing before there's a problem, so that the relationship is harmed in such a way that we feel like we need to fix it. And then we don't fix it. And now, okay, we got to withdraw. That's the least loving relationship I can think about, because it's really not even a relationship. You're not even upset with them. You're not even angry with them. You're just, oh, you're there. We have a lukewarm wave that we offer to each other when we go into the building and out. And so I think that's a starting place for me, Terry.
Well, let me say this. This whole process is heavily tied to the idea of a relationship. But in order for any of this to work, the relationship has to exist to begin with. I think one of the reasons why what we typically call, we've chosen not to use these words, but I'm going to refer to it this way. What we typically call church discipline, the reason it doesn't work is because there's no relationship as a foundation beforehand to make it effective. And, let me share. The last time I know that this came up, the way that this came up was we were effectively taking attendance. Not the last time, let me restate that. I've had this happen since then. and handle much better. But we were taking attendance, and after a while, there was a couple of people who hit that threshold of, hey, here's the number. When you do this, we gotta do something. What happened in that situation is that, quite frankly, there were some people who had missed consistently for about a year. And nobody knew why, because there was no relationship to give knowledge as to what was going on. And so then it became, hey, we got to withdraw fellowship from these people who've not been here for a year, which, by the way, we'll talk about that in a moment, perhaps, whether that's even an option, maybe is the way to put that. But it was a completely heartless decision made on the basis of numbers and data with no relationship. And as a result of that, it was completely unloving. And if that's how we handle this situation, we're failing. And by the way, here's, I guess, the best way to put this is that's not shepherding souls. That's not what that is. That's making data-driven decisions without any knowledge. And what happened before that is that nobody had a relationship with those people that was strong enough to sit back and say, hey, this person's struggling with this. Here's why they're not here. Here's what we need to do to help them. I'm a firm believer that if we were better shepherds if we had better shepherds in the church today, much of this will be avoided, because the love is there before we ever get to this point. The first time you talk about somebody and their struggles with their faith is when you're going to mark them, withdraw fellowship from them. That is not biblical love.
Yeah, let me roll it back to a great point. We got a couple of questions we're going to include in just a second. We've seen your questions, so everyone knows that. Often, and this is anecdotal. I haven't done the full statistical survey that I would want to do this, but I think it's fairly accurate. When a guy moves to a new congregation as a preacher, whether a young preacher or old, inevitably the conversation turns to, well, we got these 18 people who don't come. What are we going to do? And so the low-hanging fruit response is, okay, we're going to send them a letter. Like, that's the least loving response to a soul that you could possibly imagine. And I'll be honest, and Terry might join in too, I've participated in that early on in my preaching. I've signed those letters. He may have signed them too. Even as a Christian, before I was preaching, I participated in that model. I will tell you that at this point in my life, I have come to the conclusion that it's a waste of paper. It gives you a record to put into a file somewhere, but it does not accomplish your personal goal that you have in mind with all the right motives and all the right designs. Further, new preacher comes in and you're asking, we got to discipline all these unruly people. He's never met any of them. If anything, he should be disciplining the flock that led it to get that way from his preaching standpoint. And the flock then might also include the elders. So two of our questions, and I'll throw them out here because we're going to include this. Hal asked about admonishing unruly authority figures, particularly elders. We may have to slip that into a future dialogue, but we'll include it in principle here. I just did. And then Megan asked, what constitutes unruly? That will go into our second point a little bit. We will get into that some. Some of the translations, ESV versus New American Standard. Unruly in the New American Standard is translated for us as unruly. The word there in the ESV is idle, because they're two parts of the same whole. But the word actually is more holistic than just one of those two things. Idleness produces the kind of bad behavior that you see manifested as unruly. Anyway, we'll get to there. So from the standpoint, what we're looking at is that this is a practical thing that preachers encounter. Let's do it better. So don't. Go ahead, Jen.
Follow up what we just talked about. And I came to this conclusion many years ago, and not everybody's followed my advice on this. The last time, which is I had forgotten about, which we were involved in this kind of process, there was absolutely no letter sent, none whatsoever. And I think the letter, by the way, and those who don't understand why the letter came into existence was truthfully for legal reasons, to protect churches from liability. In the 80s, there was a church in Oklahoma where a lady who was disciplined actually sued the congregation. It was a huge, I remember as a kid that being talked about. It was in all the magazines of the Brotherhood. And so there was this thing of, we have to protect ourselves if we go to court. We need to write a letter. And those letters were completely impersonal, and they met a lot of other problems. I cannot remember a time. This is what happened in most places, and probably you too, Phil. We'd send somebody a letter, and then we'd get up and read the letter to the whole congregation. And here's the thing I got to tell you. I can't remember one time when we read that letter to the congregation where the congregation felt better off after it was over. In fact, I can tell you, every time a letter was read publicly, it caused problems on so many levels. Somebody was harmed by that. So let me say this as we move forward, because I know we're going to be time constrained. I can tell already. Stop with the letters. This has to be more personal and loving than a document. Stop sending letters. Stop reading letters. Those letters have caused us tremendous issues in that sense.
And here's the thing. The letters don't exist because of a biblical mandate to do so. They exist because of an accommodative model that we're trying to balance both legal concerns and spiritual concerns. There's a better way that's available. Let's look for it. Let's dig into it. And that's part of teaching in advance, telling people ahead of time that this is part of the package of our relationships, that when it gets strained, we're going to talk to you about it. We're going to sit down and tell you what's going on in our hearts, and having a relationship that says it's okay, and that's normal things that are going to exist in the ebb and flow of the seasons of a person's life. And that's part of this teaching package, that you teach about the subject for sure, and you be plain, and you be clear, and you be direct. First time. Second time, you do the same thing. Third time, you do the same thing, so that when you maybe have to go to a person one-on-one or 2-to-1 and say, hey, look, we've seen some struggles, and we want to talk about them. That blends into our second topic, where we're going to get down to some definitions. As far as I can reckon from the New Testament, digging into the scriptures and limiting it to what is actually in the text, there's about 3 primary pushers for issues of admonishment to move out of the 1-to-1 relationship, the 2-to-1 relationship, and into public things. And by the way, how that 1-to-1 relationship can include admonishing a particular elder. That's more of a 1-to-1 thing. But we're talking about a preacher admonishing elders as a preacher's role. We're moving into 2-to-1 bigger context. That's factious behavior. That's immoral behavior. And broadly, that's false teaching, or erroneous education. Terry, we're talking about those 3 pushers. How do you kind of look at that? Those are my perspective to it. I know that might be similar to yours. How do you kind of break that down?
Well, I agree. I mean, those are the same 3 things. And I tell you what's interesting is I've seen a lot of factious people. I've rarely seen a church mark anybody for being factious.
Right.
And it's pretty interesting that we have completely ignored the scriptural pattern of this kind of stuff. And even within those 3 areas, here's, I think, the main thing that needs to be understood. This is a step that is taken for really 2 specific reasons when you read the text. Number one, this person's life spiritually is in danger of destruction. And it is a last resort on behalf of your response to them to say, you are in danger of losing your soul if you don't change this behavior. The second reason is to protect the remaining souls from that person's influence and behavior. I mean, that's what 1 Corinthians 5 talks about with this little leaven leavens the whole lump. There is a side of this that is saying the church needs to understand and know that your influence is dangerous to them. Particularly in the area of the factious false teachers. I think those are specific areas that are particular. But in 1 Corinthians 5, it's immorality. So all 3 of those areas, part of the interest there is you're damaging this local body, and because of that, we have to change our relationship. So what that means is, just because somebody, you might be able to plug them into one of those 3 reasons, does not necessitate you disciplining them. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind. I think all of this goes back to the first discussion topic. All this requires a lot of patience and understanding and compassion And this, by the way, is a last resort. I think we need to make sure we see it that way. That's kind of how I feel about those three things.
Right. And I think clearly approaching these issues from a standpoint of, okay, where's our goal? What's our responsibility? And what does God want us to do in regards to helping grow through the issue? Where you're sparing the flock, you're protecting them at times, but maybe you're trying to redeem that soul. There's a real clear edge of consequences on either of those things. If they stay with the flock is destroyed. If they go out, their soul is destroyed. But God has a hand in each of those two things, and we've got to be better. And that's really my goal here is to do this better, because our expectations need to be managed with God's plan. And that's kind of where I'm leaning with this. And God's plan in this sense is what I mean. We kind of define our terms. We talk about what constitutes unruly behavior. That's a more general term. There's probably 10 passages that deal with this subject in specifics, and we'll probably hint at some of those. But think about this. An idle person. We'll use that edge of the translation. Idleness produces gossip. It produces lazy behavior. It produces destructive environments. This is something that God says they need to be admonished directly. It is immorality of a kind and a type that can breed into factious behavior. And it should be identified specifically and corrected. First on the one-on-one, then the two-to-one, if they don't, kind of is the model, and then maybe publicly is the method. And you have to have a relationship ahead of time for that to have any kind of good. Now, if you don't have a relationship, if you haven't taught about these subjects broadly ahead of time, there's no way you're going to actually admonish. Even more broadly, unruly or idle behavior in the picture that's connected to it in the other passages, the other things that we've mentioned there, kind of expands the idea that there's things that are step by step with it. If you go to Hebrews chapter 5 and beyond, you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, you kind of see these things in larger structures and larger pictures, that they're not just one thing and one issue. And I included 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 12 as a great passage, because that's where shepherds and leaders are laboring and admonishing the other side. Like, it's not just about the edge of you've done bad, so you're being punished. It's good structure includes general admonishment too. That's not just, oh, you're all awful. It's like, hey, we need to strengthen up and do this better. You did it well. Let's do it excellent. That's part of that bigger package. And being clear helps us understand that admonishment isn't just about reprimand. It's about restructure, reevaluation, and re-engaging again another time.
Well, and being clear, by the way, we talked about this earlier. I think one of the problems we have with clarity is, or you and I did off the video, one of the things that we have with clarity is I think we've confused our terms. We emphasize in the presentation of this discipline so much the withdrawal fellowship that has muddied the process and water. So part of this clarity would be a personal encouragement from me to leaders to try to avoid using that as the terminology for what we're doing here. You've heard me say in this broadcast about marking somebody. That's generally how I refer to it, because really I think the process is we've come to the point where this person is their actions are a danger to themselves and a danger to the church, and we have to come to the process. We have to acknowledge that publicly. We're going to note or mark that publicly. And now a side effect of that, or a result of that marking, is that our fellowship changes. But I believe that the more clear process here is to just that we are publicly acknowledging you are not who you're supposed to be. And that is the ultimate really process here. And the other things that we're going to talk about are results of us getting to this point that we have to publicly state this is what has occurred. And I think if we could teach from that level, we would change our understanding, because we have created through our terminology kind of this unconscious format of excommunication rather than admonishment. And I think
Right.
that's done some great damage in these situations. And that's part of the clarity here in this process.
Yeah, here's another way to think through this. And I used this analogy earlier on. We're going for the low-hanging flute. I want you to think about this on a personal level of the congregation. This is for our audience to kind of think through, and Terry and I have talked about this some. Of the congregations you've been part of, when was the last time someone was withdrawn for anything other than these two reasons? Not attending or something that was essentially criminal. Maybe sexual impropriety might be in that group of essentially criminalized behavior because culturally we treat them like criminals if they're adulterers. When God says we should admonish them and welcome them back, if they've repented of their sins. But think about that. How many places actually have anything other than those two models? Maybe there's some guys who will mark false teachers. They exist. The question is whether they're approaching it in a healthy way as a separate issue, although slightly related. My experience has been that really we lean into that low-hanging fruit of they stopped attending, so we're doing our duty by withdrawing from them. We're going to send them a letter. We're going to tell them they're not members here. Everyone's not going to hang around them anymore. And none of that's true, because here's the reality. You weren't hanging out with them anyway. You didn't have a relationship. They haven't been part of the fellowship for a year. And you're probably not doing the thing that is the most important part of the step. And that's part of our last point. We'll get there in a second. And it's actually the hardest one, like the strongest one, is to rise to this challenge. That letters are, here's an alliteration for all you preachers. Those letters are lies because nothing in them is practically true. You can go ahead and preach that, all you guys.
I like how we tell people, hey, I'm never going to eat with you again, and you've never eaten with them anyway.
Right.
Like that's one of the failures of this whole process. I'm never going to talk to you again and have a relationship with you, but I've not had a relationship with you anyway. I barely know your name. I mean, I've literally been in discussions where leadership is getting ready to, in their terms, withdraw fellowship from somebody who they literally don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem.
Right. So these are all part of the structures that have to go with clarity. We can't do something in a biblical way if we failed to build a biblical foundation about it, because our failure goes deeper than that. And I've got anecdotes. We might try to, as we get to the end, we'll hopefully throw some anecdotal illustrations that kind of get these principles in play. Terry's driving home. One of the things that I think is the most important aspect of this issue, I think he might agree too. Maybe everyone agrees or disagrees. That's fine. Here's the thing. Let's say you have a proper case where you've taught about this in advance. You had a relationship. You had a real relationship. But sin divided the structure that God was building between you. Maybe it was factious behavior. Maybe they were grossly immoral or teaching false doctrine. And you see them in town. You see them at the grocery store. You see them at the Chick-fil-A. You see them at the restaurants or whatever. My perspective of what admonishment looks like is that that's the time where I do the thing that's super hard. I actually go talk to them and tell them that I love them and I want a relationship with them again. And ask them, how are they doing spiritually? Like not just, hey, how you doing today? How are you really doing in your relationship with God? That's hard. For someone who tries to do it, I'll tell you it's hard. It's effective, but it's hard. And I'm going to, go ahead, Terry.
Well, I think, let me say this, I think that's where this semantical change in our approach, when you keep saying that, hey, we withdrew fellowship from Ted, and you see Ted at Walmart, when you think of withdrawing fellowship, what you think of is, oh no, Ted's on the salad dressing aisle. I can't go down the salad dressing aisle right now because we withdrew from Ted. And that's not biblical. Well, what actually is supposed to happen here is you've publicly noted that somebody is unfaithful, which is a responsibility now that is given to the entire congregation, that if you see Ted, you have a responsibility to talk to Ted. Not to avoid Ted, but to go talk to Ted and to tell Ted that you've prayed for him, you miss him, you want to see him back, you want to encourage him in any way you can to fix his life. In my internship at Riverside Drive, every week I went out with an elder to go visit. His name was Kenneth Dallas. He was not the most educated of men. He was a mechanic and a country boy, and I loved him dearly. And we would go see some people who had not been there. And he had the easiest way. We'd go see them. We'd talk about whatever, Tennessee football, the weather, their health. And then he would just go, we've missed seeing you around. And you kind of need to come back and get your life fixed. And we'd like to help you in that. And it wasn't accusatory. It wasn't ugly. It was just, hey, we realize you're not faithful, and we want to help you out with that. You need to get straight with the Lord. He didn't go in with fingers pointed. He didn't go in judging and criticizing. In fact, you couldn't help but think that Kenneth loved you. Like Kenneth had this, he missed you kind of aspect. That's exactly what we're talking about, is just going in and saying, hey, we miss seeing you. And they know what that means. And it can be that easy, by the way, sometimes to say that. Yeah. It's not this difficult. Hey, you're a factious person, and you got to go forward during the invitation song. And no, it's really more simple. And I think we've compounded this and made it a lot more difficult than it is. But at the end of the day, when you see Ted at Walmart, you got to go down his aisle. If you don't need anything on the salad dressing aisle, you go buy a bottle of ranch dressing, which everybody needs in their pantry anyway, just so you can talk to Ted. That's what the Bible really says.
And we've raised the bar in expectations quite a bit, from the low-hanging fruit of the church sent them a letter to having a relationship that's being damaged by sin to wanting it back. Rebuilding a relationship is hard. Talk to people who have had marital problems and they're trying to fix it. It's hard. And I'll use this illustration. One of the hardest parts of my journey as a believer in Christ is dealing with the unfaithfulness of family members. It gets super close. And one of the things that I've tried to do well is to be clear about that and state that this is the most important thing in our relationship. And I want you in my life, but until this is fixed, there's so many broken things that matter, that this matters the most. And so you know what makes it awkward is that whenever we talk, I talk about that. Like, that's going to be the thing we talk about. Even when they say, yeah, I don't want to talk about it. Well, the next conversation, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And okay, it's awkward, but guess what? Sin's awkward. That's just how it is. And if we care enough to want to go to heaven, if we care enough to want them to go to heaven, then we're going to get over the awkwardness of the salad aisle, the salad dressing aisle. It's not a big deal. And I'll add this caveat to it. Oh, go ahead, Terry. I can jump back out.
I was going to say real quick that I think one of our problems with this too is we're so legalistic in our approach to this issue that we take this "we can't eat with such a one" to such an extreme. I'm going to get into an area where some people may disagree with me. That if the only time somebody can meet with me to talk about their soul is on their lunch break, then I'm going to go on their lunch break to talk to them. And I've been told, well, you can go, but you can't eat. And I appreciate if you feel that way, but I tell you this, at the end of the day, what's important is I admonish that person to get their life right with God. I don't think, and you may disagree with this, but I don't think that was such a statement of not eating with them that it was a literal never eat a morsel of bread in their presence. It was more of an idea of, if you look at the context of, this relationship has changed, period. We don't hang out. We don't socialize. We don't have fun like we used to have fun. We do things differently now. My goal in those conversations from now on is to get you to change your life and start serving the Lord again. And I've got to seek every opportunity to accomplish that. And that's the challenge.
And I'll add my comment to it. Contextually speaking, the type of sin that's being dealt with in 1 Corinthians where this term comes up should be so disgusting that you should be so uncomfortable that you should have already crossed that bridge a long time ago. Going to have a meal with that guy is an entirely different thing than the person who just hasn't been attending for a while, or maybe is struggling with other issues in their life. They've been sucked off into different kinds of sin. There's a high level of disgust that is in that text there. My problem is that we sometimes take that high end extreme and we apply it again to that low fruit, the person who just stopped attending for unknown reasons. And we say, well, I don't know why he's coming, but I'm not going to eat with him anymore. And that means in practicality, I'll never talk to him again. And I'll just say it in a very end game perspective. If I can get a guy to talk to me and it requires me to buy him a meal, then guess what I'm going to do? I will go buy the meal, right?
I'm going to buy him tacos.
Yeah, because tacos make everything better. Tacos is because look, if you go to the shirt right here, everybody loves tacos. It's tacos versus nobody. They have no enemies. Everybody loves tacos. I don't know if you can see the shirt, but it's Tuesday. I had to pull it out. I had to pull out the Superman shirt. Everybody loves tacos. Everybody should love an opportunity to sit down with someone that they love and tell them that they love them and they miss them and they want a genuine relationship. The hardest part of dealing with someone who has fallen away, who shares a blood tie with you, is the lack of the relationship that you know that could be there and that used to be there. And if you don't feel that way when you're writing a letter, and if you choose to write a letter, make sure you're doing a good job with it. I'll say that as a caveat. I'm not a big fan of it, but if you're going to write that letter, it better be the best letter you've ever written. And your tears should be present on the page. If that makes any kind of sense there.
In this being hopeful, there may be a need on our part to be apologetic to the person we're admonishing. What if I see Ted and I've never had a relationship with Ted? I'm going to tell you how my conversation gets started. Hey, Ted, I know what's going on, but I need to tell you something. I need to apologize to you because I didn't have the kind of relationship I should have had with you to begin with. And I would like to rebuild that. I would like for us to have a relationship. And if you are willing to come back, I would like to be a part of that process. All of that is part of this, I think, of this acknowledgement that, and there has to be, if we failed somebody, we have to acknowledge we failed them to begin with, and we contributed to the process of them leaving and not returning in order for this ability to be hopeful that they will return. And I don't know that we're always willing to confess our shortfalls in this area as well.
Right. And when Terry says that, I'm amening it from the perspective of preacher, elder, deacon, servant, Christian. Our participation is group level, not me level. But on the application, it's always going to come down to, did I do the part that I could play in building a relationship or seeking to rebuild a healthy one on the end of it? I'll add this, and Terry and I've talked about this some. There's no easy answers to the application the closer it gets to family. I know of issues where you've had husbands and wives in spiritual turmoil, and one spouse is being withdrawn from, and what is the wife's obligation? I said she's got to balance two awful choices. She has the awful responsibility, awful in the most grand sense, of still being the biggest encourager to someone who has broken the most significant relationship that they have in life. That's their relationship with their Lord. But they still have a relationship and an obligation to their spouse. Navigating through that is going to be awful. And if you don't understand that that's going to be awful, you have no business commenting on the practicalities of it. The same thing is true if it's parent to child to parent, aunt to uncle. All of those things are a soup sandwich of bad. And how you navigate through them is going to be incredibly challenging. But let me say this. Do not allow the existence of that familiar tie to tell you, well, then I don't have to withdraw from them. Everybody else has to, but I don't. Everyone else has to admonish them, but I don't. In fact, I will say you have twice the obligation. You're probably more needed to.
To anybody who's not been in that situation with that close proximity, an encouragement to you would be to be very quiet in your criticism of those who are, because it's like so many other things, we have all the answers until we find ourselves in the same situation, and they're very tough. But it's like with a husband and wife. The wife has a responsibility to admonish her husband. She also has a responsibility to be a wife And let's be honest, First Peter 3 says that in a situation where a wife's husband is not who he should be, but one of the large ways she does that is by continuing to be who she's supposed to be as his wife.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you may not agree with how she does that. Understand she's in an awful predicament, and she's probably doing it to the best of her ability. And we need to be very patient and loving in those situations.
You know, there's a family I've known, and I knew him as a young preacher first. They had the awful circumstance where one of their older children had engaged in significant immorality, and they needed to withdraw from him on the congregational level. He also had a responsibility to him as a dad, and he still wasn't, and I'll say, of age to move out of the home. And his choices were difficult. He's like, I want to follow the biblical injunction not to eat with them. How am I going to do that while still providing for him in the home? He needs to be admonished. I'm his dad. I can discipline him. How do I do that? But yet he's my brother in Christ. And there is no good answer to any of that. No easy solution. And so he's got a guy living with him who legally should be living with him, but spiritually needs to be admonished. Now I've got this other injunction that I have to keep. Well, what am I going to do with that? I can tell him not to do things, but he's rebellious too. I can kick him out, but now why am I kicking out an underage child? Is that hard? Oh, it certainly is hard. And did he do the best he could do in that scenario? Like, I believe he did. And my role then was to support him. And if I interact with his son outside of that home environment, I had better go to him. If I see him in the store, I want him to know that I care about him too, even though I probably had the least of the relationship with that young man at the time, because all of that took place before I arrived on the scene. That relationship of that context was established before I got there. And so I had no prior relationship, but I had an obligation because he's my brother in Christ who is now struggling with sin. And if you think your situation is more complicated, it probably is. And I applaud you as you work through it. And I want to support you in trying to do the best. Terry and I talked earlier, we got 30 minutes to talk about like a 4-hour subject. And so some of these tendrils will certainly kick up to the curb for other discussions, maybe talking about admonishing elders, although we have covered that in the past. If you scroll back in the earlier video series, we've talked about working with elders, and we included a little bit there. And certainly we may drill down into the definitions of some of these terms again in the future on a technical level. Because I think understanding what these terms mean is important too. Withdrawal, excommunication, shunning, admonishing, all of them are basket terms. They're included in the big basket of God's discipline through the local church and through Christians and their relationships to each other. Terry, we've had it for 38 minutes. We're trying our best to be brief. We're not succeeding. You got any last thoughts?
Well, on this subject, let me just say it's a very difficult one. And I think it traditionally, historically, it's so difficult that churches have a lot of times just thrown their hands up in the air and said it's just impossible to do this. And I think that I hope discussions like this will help people understand it's not impossible. What really may be a problem here is we've just lost our focus on what the goal is and our understanding of what the method is. And then if we can restore that back, that understanding to what is really the method, what is really the purpose of this, that we can practice this in a more effective, efficient way. And if there's any admonishment to the general populace of our brethren, it would be that the thing you need to do today about this subject is you need to go out this week and start building relationships with those members in your local body. And I would even say, especially, Paul said to the weaker members, we give more honor. You need to look around the auditorium the next time you're there. Find the people who aren't there much. Find the people who seem to be struggling, and you go out of your way to build a relationship with those individuals and to build a relationship that will help and encourage them, so we never get to this point where we have to figure out how to admonish them because they have been noted and withdrawn from.
Yeah. And that's again, in this particular broadcast, and like some of ours, we're trying to raise the bar above what we have seen as mistakes made in our own work and in our own experiences and saying, okay, now looking back, we did this, but we really should be reaching for this. And I guarantee you, once you start doing that in this area, you're going to get a better relationship with your brethren. You're more likely to see people return because they're going to want to be there. And here's a practical thing. Eventually, that guy that's in the ranch dressing aisle in the grocery store, he's going to see you coming. He's going to know what you're going to want to talk about. And if you develop a good model of behavior with them, they're not going to run away.
No.
And in fact, they're probably going to be a little bit humble in their response and maybe open the door this much wider to the next conversation. And maybe you're not the one who's going to have it. It may be somebody else. Maybe a third party who goes and catches them. One of the elders at Jerry Whitson Road for years, Faith Latt, along with his fellow elder, Maria Wilmoth, they were really great at opening doors with people who are struggling spiritually and just saying, hey, how you doing? Let's spend a little time together. And they did it with kindness and compassion. And like many others, they weren't eloquent. Words were not their game. But you knew that they cared. And they knew that they were persistent in their care. Side note, I was down in Florida this past weekend. I got to interact with a number of folks who have seen our videos. And I want to say openly right now, I really appreciate each and every one of you for participating in the ways that you do, dropping comments, private conversations with us. It's very encouraging to me. I know it's encouraging to Terry to know that there's some second order good being done. The first order is then Terry and I get better. Iron sharpens iron. That's our primary value. Secondary value is that others see profit in them. And I'm really encouraged by that. I enjoy listening to other people describe their work. And if our videos somehow have a benefit to it, however you're going to call them, vlogs, videos, do the work, Terry and I laughing at each other, for the most part, that's what we kind of do. I just want to say I'm thankful for that. If you see one of us anywhere, feel free to come up and talk to us, even if we don't know who you are, because I'll freely admit one of my deep anxieties is going into a group of, say, alumni or people I'm supposed to know, and I've forgotten all your names. And so I'm afraid of that too. So introduce yourself and say, hey, happy to meet and talk to you. Terry, last thoughts before we close?
Yeah, just to echo your appreciation of all this, I will tell you that it is funny. Somebody came up to me the other day and said in front of my wife and kids, oh, yeah, I've watched your videos with Phil. That's great. Keep up the good work. And as we walked away, my wife openly mocked me for being a legend in my own mind. So if you're watching this video, thanks for that. It's always good to be kept humble by your wife. And but no, seriously, we do appreciate you guys talking to us and encouraging us. This is whatever you're gaining, Phil and I are gaining more. I can guarantee you that, and it's something that we're appreciative of your feedback.
Yep. Pray for Terry. His oldest is in college. If you feel so inclined, you can pray for me. My oldest is in college, or pray for them, and we probably like that better. We want them to grow and to to be super successful beyond their parents, and they're already doing that as it is. Well, at least Jesse is. I'm not so sure about Pork Chop. He's iffy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Right.
May the Lord watch over you and bless you. See you, Terry.
See you.